Picture this: a massive oil tanker, one of the largest class of vessels that sails the world's oceans, capable of carrying 2 million barrels of crude, approaches the Strait of Hormuz. Its tracking system is fully active. It is making no attempt at concealment, no darkness, no deception, no evasive maneuvers. The United States Navy has deployed more than 15 warships in these waters. Thousands of American service members, including Marines and Special Operations Forces, are on station, enforcing what Washington has declared a formal naval blockade of Iranian ports. The message broadcast across maritime frequencies could not have been clearer. Do not attempt to breach the blockade. Vessels will be boarded for interdiction and seizure. If you do not comply, we will use force. The whole of the United States Navy is ready to enforce compliance, and yet the tanker sails straight through. No interception, no boarding, no confrontation. Openly in broad daylight with its transponder on, the vessel transits directly into Iranian waters, and the most powerful navy in the history of the world watches it happen. At almost the same moment, on the other side of the planet, China's foreign ministry is standing at its podium delivering its own message to Washington. Measured in tone, precise in language, but unmistakable in intent. China consistently opposes illegal unilateral sanctions that lack a basis in international law. China will firmly safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of its enterprises. And then, cutting across all of it, a remark from the President of the United States himself, delivered casually but carrying the weight of an earthquake. It's over. 3 words. About a war that had rattled global markets, threatened to engulf the Middle East, and pushed the world to the edge of a crisis that most observers believed was still intensifying. It's over. Welcome to Frontline Reports. I'm Nico. Today we are unpacking one of the most dramatic and rapidly shifting geopolitical stories of this era. A U.S. naval blockade of Iran that the entire world is watching, and that tankers are already slipping through. A Chinese government whose language on American sanctions has shifted from diplomatic protest to something that sounds increasingly like an open challenge to Washington's authority to dictate the terms of global commerce. A war that may, or may not, be ending, depending on who you ask and which hour of the day you ask them. And underneath all of it, a set of questions that go far deeper than any single military confrontation or diplomatic standoff. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? What happens when the world's largest oil importer refuses to recognize the world's most powerful navy's right to blockade a country it trades with? And what does Donald Trump's extraordinary declaration, "It's over," actually mean for a region that has been on a knife's edge for weeks? Let's get into it. To understand the full weight of what is unfolding, you first need to understand what a naval blockade actually is, and why the United States declaring one against Iran is an act of such enormous geopolitical consequence. A naval blockade is not a sanction. It is not a diplomatic warning. It is not a strongly worded resolution at the United Nations. A naval blockade is an act of war under international law, a physical assertion of military control over the maritime approaches of a sovereign nation, enforced by the threat and, if necessary, the reality of lethal force. The United States Central Command made its position absolutely explicit in the audio broadcast that has now been heard around the world. The U.S. has announced a formal blockade of Iranian ports and coastal areas. This is a legal action. That last phrase, "This is a legal action," is itself a statement of profound significance. The United States is asserting that its unilateral decision to blockade Iranian ports carries the force of international law. China's response, offered through its foreign ministry spokesman, makes clear that Beijing sees it very differently. That in China's view, what Washington has declared is precisely the kind of unilateral action that, in the absence of United Nations Security Council authorization, lacks any legitimate basis in international law. The gap between those two positions is not a semantic one. It is a fundamental disagreement about who has the authority to define what is legal in international waters. And it is a disagreement that is now being played out, not in diplomatic conference rooms, but on the surface of the Persian Gulf. The scale of the American military commitment to enforcing this blockade is substantial. More than 15 warships have been deployed to the region. Thousands of U.S. service members are on station, including not just conventional naval personnel, but Marines and Special Operations Forces, units whose presence signals that Washington is prepared for the possibility of boarding operations and close-quarters confrontations at sea. U.S. Central Command subsequently reported that American forces had intercepted at least 8 oil tankers attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports since the blockade took effect. According to officials cited by the Wall Street Journal, in every one of those instances, the tankers complied with U.S. orders and turned around without any physical boarding being necessary. The message from Washington was clear: the blockade is working. American forces have, in the Pentagon's own framing, completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran through the sea, achieving what U.S. Central Command characterized as maritime superiority in the Middle East. For a moment, a brief and significant moment, it looked like the blockade might actually hold. And then, the tankers started getting through. The first significant breach of the U.S. blockade occurred with a degree of brazenness that immediately raised questions about the practical enforceability of Washington's maritime cordon. According to Iranian state media, a very large crude carrier, the class of supertanker capable of carrying up to 2 million barrels of oil, entered Iranian waters openly. Its automatic identification system tracking was active. The crew made no attempt to disguise the vessel's identity or destination. It transited the Strait of Hormuz and entered Iran's territorial waters without being intercepted. The Strait of Hormuz, for those unfamiliar with its geography, is one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. At its narrowest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide. Through it passes approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply every single day. It is the maritime gateway between the Persian Gulf and the open waters of the Arabian Sea. And for Iran, it is the primary access point for seaborne trade in either direction. If the U.S. Navy was going to enforce a blockade of Iranian ports, the Strait of Hormuz was where that enforcement would be most visible and most directly tested. And the tanker that sailed through, according to Iranian state media, did so without concealment, almost as if making a deliberate point. The second significant breach involved a vessel with a direct connection to China. Shipping data revealed that a U.S.-sanctioned Chinese tanker, identified in reports as the Rich Starry, which had been blacklisted by Washington for its involvement in Iran-related oil dealings, transited the Strait of Hormuz on April 14th. This vessel had loaded approximately 250,000 barrels of methanol in the UAE, and then sailed past the U.S. Navy cordon, which had formally come into effect on April 13th. The timing is difficult to dismiss as coincidental. The blockade became operational on the 13th. A sanctioned Chinese tanker passed through it on the 14th. Whether this constitutes a deliberate test of American resolve, a calculated act of defiance, or simply a commercial operator making a calculated risk assessment is a question that different observers answer differently. But the symbolic significance is unmistakable. Bloomberg's vessel tracking data complicated the picture somewhat, suggesting that the Rich Starry transited the strait, but subsequently turned around in the Gulf of Oman rather than completing its journey to an Iranian port. The full picture of what happened remains somewhat contested between different monitoring sources. Meanwhile, Reuters reported that a U.S. destroyer intercepted 2 oil tankers that had departed Chabahar Port, Iran's main port on the Gulf of Oman, and ordered them to reverse course. The ships, contacted by the warship via radio, apparently complied. This represented the blockade functioning as advertised, though the vessels had already departed Iranian waters before being turned back. The emerging picture is of a blockade that is partially effective, that has succeeded in turning back some vessels and creating significant commercial disruption. But that is not hermetically sealed. Oil is getting through. Tankers are finding or probing gaps. And the political and practical constraints on actually using force against vessels from countries like China make full enforcement considerably more complicated than the original declaration suggested. As one analyst put it with characteristic bluntness, the blockade is already leaking oil into global markets, and in doing so, making something of a mockery of the siege that Washington announced with such confidence. Throughout this entire escalation, from the early stages of the U.S.-Iran military confrontation through the declaration of the blockade and the subsequent breaches, China's official position has been stated with remarkable consistency. At the Foreign Ministry's regular press briefings in Beijing, spokesman after spokesman has delivered variations of the same core message, expressed in the precise and calibrated language of Chinese diplomatic communication. China consistently opposes what it characterizes as illegal unilateral sanctions, measures imposed by a single country or group of countries without authorization from the United Nations Security Council. China urges the United States to cease what it describes as the erroneous practice of abusing sanctions and extending extraterritorial jurisdiction over entities and individuals who operate under Chinese law and protection. And China states, with language that has grown increasingly firm over successive press briefings, that it will safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of its enterprises. That last phrase, firmly safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of its enterprises, is worth examining carefully, because in the context of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, it carries a very specific meaning. China is the world's largest importer of Iranian crude oil. Chinese state-owned energy companies and private trading firms have continued to purchase Iranian oil throughout years of American sanctions, transactions that Washington has repeatedly characterized as sanction violations, and that have resulted in secondary sanctions being applied to specific Chinese vessels, companies, and individuals. From Beijing's perspective, these transactions are legal under Chinese law and consistent with bilateral economic agreements between China and Iran. From Washington's perspective, they are violations of a sanctions regime that the United States claims has global jurisdiction, the long-arm jurisdiction that China's foreign ministry has specifically and repeatedly criticized. This is not a new disagreement. It has been running for years, producing a steady stream of sanctioned Chinese entities, Chinese diplomatic protests, and continued Chinese oil purchases from Iran that proceed despite the American sanctions regime. What is new is the physical context in which this disagreement is now being conducted. When the disagreement was about financial sanctions, about which companies could access the U.S. financial system and which couldn't, the direct confrontation was largely economic and administrative. Now, with a naval blockade in place, the disagreement has a physical military dimension. The question of whether Chinese commercial entities can legally trade with Iran is no longer purely theoretical. It is being answered in real time on the surface of the Persian Gulf. China's officials have also addressed broader concerns related to this crisis with characteristic care. When the shooting incidents that accompanied the military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran were raised at press briefings, China expressed concern and reiterated its firm opposition to all acts of illegal violence. When questions were raised about specific Chinese citizens allegedly involved in activities of concern, the Foreign Ministry spokesman reiterated that China consistently requires its citizens abroad to abide by local laws, while simultaneously defending the right of Chinese companies to conduct legitimate business without American extraterritorial interference. The message threading through all of these statements, taken together, is one of sustained, principled, and increasingly assertive pushback against what Beijing views as American overreach, an attempt to use economic and now military coercion to dictate the terms of global commerce in ways that China explicitly rejects as illegitimate. The United States says the blockade is legal. China says it is illegal. Iran says it is illegal. Most international legal scholars who have weighed in on the question express significant skepticism about the legal basis for a unilateral naval blockade imposed without UN Security Council authorization. Under international law, as it has developed over the past century, naval blockades are generally recognized as lawful instruments of warfare between belligerent states during an armed conflict. They are not generally recognized as lawful tools of economic coercion available to any nation willing to deploy sufficient naval power to enforce one. The UN Charter, to which both the United States and China are signatories, prohibits the use of force in a manner inconsistent with its purposes, which include the maintenance of international peace and security and the peaceful resolution of disputes. A naval blockade that threatens to sink or seize vessels from third countries that have not joined the underlying conflict raises serious questions under this framework. The United States' argument that the blockade is a legal action rests on a combination of its designation of Iran as a sponsor of terrorism, its characterization of Iranian oil exports as funding for hostile activities, and its assertion of the right to take necessary measures to protect regional security. These are arguments that Washington has made in various forms to justify previous uses of extraterritorial sanctions. But none of these arguments has received explicit validation from the UN Security Council, primarily because China and Russia, both permanent members with veto power, would block any such resolution. And it is precisely the absence of that multilateral authorization that forms the core of China's objection. China has stated explicitly that it opposes sanctions that, in its characterization, lack proper basis in international law and have not received authorization from the UN Security Council. This is not merely a legalistic argument for the sake of argument. It reflects China's consistent strategic position that the United States does not have the right to unilaterally impose its conception of international order on the rest of the world, a position that Beijing has articulated with growing confidence as its own economic and military power has grown. For smaller nations watching this confrontation unfold, the legal question has direct and practical implications. If the United States can declare a naval blockade of any country it designates as a security threat, and enforce that blockade against the shipping of any nation that continues to trade with the target, the extraterritorial reach of American economic coercion becomes effectively unlimited. Every nation's trade relationships become contingent on American approval. China regards this prospect as fundamentally unacceptable, and its willingness to challenge it, both rhetorically and, through the actions of its sanctioned tankers, physically, represents one of the most significant tests of the post-1945 international order in recent memory. To fully appreciate the stakes of what is unfolding, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz means to the global economy, because honestly, no body of water on Earth carries more economic weight per square kilometer. The strait is the exit point for oil produced in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran, countries that together sit on the largest concentration of proven oil reserves anywhere on the planet. Every day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil transit these narrow waters, depending on production levels and demand. That represents approximately 1/5 of global oil consumption, moving through a bottleneck that at its narrowest point is barely wider than the distance between two highway exits. The shipping lanes themselves are extremely constrained. Inbound vessels use a 2-mile wide lane on one side of the strait. Outbound vessels use another 2-mile wide lane on the other side. Between them sits a 2-mile buffer zone. In a waterway that is already congested with supertankers, naval vessels, fishing boats, and commercial shipping of every description, the margin for error, or for confrontation, is extraordinarily small. For oil-importing nations in Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, and China, the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a convenient route. It is, for many of their energy imports, the only practical maritime route. Oil that cannot transit Hormuz must either be transported by alternative land routes, which exist in limited form and at much higher cost, or simply not delivered. This geographic reality is what gives Iran and the US-Iran confrontation such enormous global resonance. A conflict that is, at its core, about the political and military relationship between two countries, the United States and Iran, has the potential to directly affect the energy security and economic stability of dozens of nations that have no direct involvement in the dispute. When the U.S. imposed its naval blockade, the immediate effect was not just felt in Tehran. Oil markets moved globally. Freight insurance premiums in the region spiked. Shipping companies began rerouting or delaying transits. Governments in Tokyo, Seoul, New Delhi, and Beijing, all heavily dependent on Gulf oil, began assessing contingency options. China, as we discussed earlier, has invested heavily over the past decade in building energy resilience. Strategic petroleum reserves, pipeline alternatives, domestic renewable capacity, and a rapidly electrifying vehicle fleet. Precisely because scenarios like this one were always a foreseeable risk. But even with those buffers in place, sustained disruption of Hormuz transit would impose significant costs on the Chinese economy. This is why the breach of the blockade by the Iranian supertanker and the apparent transit of a sanctioned Chinese vessel carries significance well beyond the individual vessels involved. These are not just commercial transactions. They are signals about the limits of what the U.S. naval cordon can actually achieve when parties with both the economic incentive and the political will to challenge it decide to test its edges. And then came the remark that changed the entire tenor of the story. Maria Bartiromo, a journalist with close access to President Donald Trump, reported that she had spoken with Trump directly ahead of a scheduled interview. During that conversation, she pressed him on a question that had been puzzling close observers of his public statements about the Iran situation. Why did he keep speaking about the war in the past tense, as if it had already concluded? Trump's answer was two words: it's over. The brevity of the statement is almost as striking as its content. Not we are making progress toward ending it. Not we expect a ceasefire agreement soon. Not even we are in negotiations. Just, it's over. The remark stands in sharp and jarring contrast to the posture that Washington had been maintaining until that point. Just days earlier, senior American officials had been warning that military action could resume if Iran failed to agree to specific long-term ceasefire terms. The rhetoric from the administration had been that of a coercive negotiation, use of military force to extract diplomatic concessions, not of a completed chapter. And yet here was the President of the United States, in what appeared to be an unguarded conversational moment, rather than a prepared statement, describing the conflict in the past tense with definitive finality. What does "it's over" actually mean in this context? The most straightforward interpretation is that a ceasefire or diplomatic understanding had been reached, possibly at a level of specificity or commitment that had not yet been publicly disclosed. Trump confirmed during the same conversation that a second round of negotiations with Iran could take place within days, which at minimum suggests that direct or indirect communication channels between Washington and Tehran were significantly more active than the public posture of maximum pressure had indicated. A second interpretation is that Trump was signaling a personal decision to de-escalate, that regardless of what the formal military and diplomatic machinery had produced, the president himself had concluded that the confrontation had achieved its primary purposes and that continued escalation no longer served American interests. A third, more cautious reading is that the remark reflects the gap between presidential communication style and the actual state of complex diplomatic situations, that "it's over" was an expression of intent or desire rather than a statement of accomplished fact, and that the detailed work of actually ending the confrontation remained very much in progress. What is clear is that the declaration, however it is interpreted, represents a significant pivot. The shift from threatening to resume military action to telling a journalist it's over is not a gradual evolution of policy. It is an abrupt change of register, one that creates its own pressures and expectations, both domestically and internationally. If Trump says it's over, and then it isn't, if military action resumes, or if the blockade continues indefinitely without a diplomatic resolution, the credibility cost is substantial. Conversely, if the declaration was genuine and a diplomatic framework is emerging, the question becomes what Iran has agreed to, what the United States has agreed to, and whether those agreements are durable enough to actually end the underlying conflict rather than merely pause it. While the Iran crisis has dominated the headlines, the diplomatic activity surrounding it has been unfolding on multiple tracks simultaneously, and some of those tracks involve China in ways that add further complexity to the overall picture. At Beijing's foreign ministry, the same period that saw Chinese spokesmen issuing daily statements on the Iran blockade also saw activity on the China-Australia bilateral relationship. Foreign Minister Wang Yi was preparing to host Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong for the 8th China-Australia Foreign and Strategic Dialogue, a meeting that, as Beijing characterized it, would advance the implementation of consensus reached by the leaders of both countries, enhance political mutual trust, and deepen cooperation between two nations, whose relationship went through